Well, boys and girls, now that you're here, let's take a look at what we've got planned. It's Core Knowledge Language Art Day today, and we're going to be exploring Food Chain Part 1. To kick things off, we'll start by immersing ourselves in core vocabulary, laying down the foundation for our exploration. Next, we'll reflect on what we've already discovered and ponder over our existing knowledge. Then, it's time for an engaging read-aloud session, where I'll bring the story to life. Finally, we'll wrap up our session with comprehension questions to deepen our understanding, followed by some word work to solidify our grasp on the topic. So, get ready for an enriching journey through the world of language arts and the fascinating realm of food chains. We'll be having new vocabulary today about consumers. It's a noun. It means animals or other living organisms in a food chain that eat other living things. Here's an example. Rabbits and squirrels are consumers of plants, and hawks are consumers of both rabbits and squirrels. Variation is consumer. Decomposers, it's a noun. It means types of consumers, such as bacteria, fungi, and worms, that break down dead animals and plants, the final link in a food chain. Here is an example. Fungi are essential decomposers, helping to break down dead organisms on which they grow. Variation is decomposer. Food chain, it's a noun. It means a relationship of living things as food sources for other living things. Here is an example. Jeremy drew a food chain of a seed, a mouse, and an owl. Variation, food chains, food webs, it's a noun. It means interconnected food chains. Here is an example. The food chains of the different types of species living in the ocean often interconnect, creating various food webs. Variation is food web. Interdependent, it's an adjective. It means describes people or things that rely on each other. Hers is an example. The different systems in the human body are not only interconnected, but also interdependent, because they all need to function properly to work together as a whole. Variation, there is none. Photosynthesis, it's a noun. It means the process in green plants that uses light to turn water and carbon dioxide into food. Here is an example. During photosynthesis, water, nutrients, and light come together in a green plant's leaves. This is how plants make food for themselves and for the organisms that consume them. Variation, there is none. Producers, it's a noun. It means organisms that make their own energy and provide their own nutrients. Here is an example. Green plants are important producers in an ecosystem and are the first link in a food chain. Variation is producer. I hope everyone's feeling ready for another exciting day of learning. Let's kick things off by revisiting what we discussed in our previous read-aloud session. Who can remind us what we were learning about?
We were talking about ecosystems.
That's right. And what do we call the field of science that studies the households of animals and plants?
Ecology.
Excellent job. Now, can someone tell me what an ecologist does?
They study ecology.
Exactly. Now, let's delve a bit deeper. What is a habitat?
It's like an animal's home, right? It gives them food, water, shelter, and space.
Spot on. And how about ecosystems? Who can explain what those are?
Ecosystems are like communities where living and non-living things interact. They're made up of different habitats.
Great explanation. Now let's take a look at some image cards. Can anyone identify the types of ecosystems shown here? And what kinds of habitats might we find within them?
The first one looks like a forest, and I think there could be habitats like trees, bushes, and streams.
Excellent observation. Who else wants to share?
The second one looks like a desert. There might be habitats like sand dunes, cacti, and burrows.
Very well done. So within each ecosystem, we find different habitats, each suited for specific types of plants and animals. Now, can anyone give examples of animals well adapted to live in these ecosystems?
In the forest, there could be bears, deer, and squirrels.
Absolutely. And in the desert?
Maybe camels, snakes, and scorpions.
Fantastic answers, everyone. You all have a great understanding of ecosystems and habitats. Keep up the excellent work. All right, everyone, let's shift our focus to today's read aloud. The title is Food Chains, Part 1. Can anyone share what a food chain is?
It's like a chain of who eats who, right?
Exactly. A food chain shows the relationship between living things as food sources for one another. Now, let's visualize this concept. Here, the wheat is a food source for the mouse, and then the mouse becomes the food source for the cat. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's like a cycle of eating.
Precisely! Now let's get creative. Can anyone provide one or two simple food chains of your own?
How about from grass to rabbit to fox?
Excellent! Grass is eaten by the rabbit, and then the rabbit becomes food for the fox. Great example. Anyone else?
I have one. Fish, seal, polar bear.
Wonderful. Fish are eaten by seals, and seals become a food source for polar bears. You all are grasping this concept really well. Keep thinking about different food chains and how they work in nature. All right, class, before we dive into today's read aloud, let's take a moment to revisit something from our previous session. Do you remember Zeke the ecologist asking us to think about how we are connected to an ant or a bee? That's right. He asked us to think about it. Well, today we'll finally discover whether our predictions were correct. So, get ready to see if you were on the mark with your thoughts. Let's jump into the read aloud and see where our connections lie. Well, it's time to read our read aloud. Last time we met, I talked about ecosystems that cover different parts of the Earth. What is an ecosystem? An ecosystem is a community of both living organisms and non-living things that interact with one another and their physical environment. Living and non-living things work together in an ecosystem. They are interconnected and depend on one another. They are, in other words, interdependent. Different habitats or homes exist within a particular ecosystem. Who can tell me what type of ecosystem this is? That's right, it's rainforest. What kinds of habitats and animals do you see? Good job, trees and monkeys, water and turtles, ground and worm, etc. Remember, habitats are where plant and animal species normally live and grow. Species are groups of living organisms that share the same characteristics. Because they also share the same needs, they live in a shared habitat where all of their needs can be met. What do organisms need to survive or continue to live? All organisms within a habitat and all habitats within an ecosystem are connected by a common need: food. Food provides nutrients and energy, or fuel, which organisms need in order to grow, breathe, and move around. Where does this energy come from? Yes, the sun's energy is transferred in different ways as fuel for different organisms, but the source of nearly all our energy comes from the same place: the sun. Almost all the energy needed for life on Earth comes from sunlight. Ecosystems, from deserts to rainforests, may look very different from one another, but they all depend on the sun for energy. Energy flows through the ecosystem, passing from sunlight to plants, animals, and humans. This energy then also passes through plants to animals and humans. All living things within an ecosystem are interdependent on one another. They need one another in order to survive. Plants, animals, and humans are linked by the transfer of this energy in the food they eat. For example, when you eat an apple, you are part of a link in a chain. Where did that apple come from? A tree. And where did the tree get its energy or food needed to grow the apple? From sunlight. The sun's energy passed from the tree's fruit to you. You and the tree are both links in the same chain. The food chain. That's a rather simple example, with only two links: you and the tree. These links, or connecting steps in the food chain, are called trophic trophic levels. Say the word trophic with me. You will hear the word trophic throughout the rest of these read-alouds when discussing the connecting steps in a food chain. Listen carefully to learn about trophic levels. Because every living organism needs to eat, every organism belongs to at least one food chain. Every food chain has at least two feeding, or trophic levels. Trophic levels show who eats what within an ecosystem. There are many, many food chains in nature, and every one of them has three essential or necessary parts: producers, consumers, and decomposers. Let's take a look at each part. All food chains begin with living things that produce their own food. On land, green plants are the main producers. Plants are the only living things that make their own food. How do they do that? That's right. They depend on the sun. The sun's energy enters the plant's leaves. Plants absorb water through their underground roots and take in carbon dioxide, a gas, from the air. Carbon dioxide is a gas produced when humans and animals breathe out, or when carbon-based fuel is burned. With the help of the sun's energy, plants change water and carbon dioxide into the food they need to grow. This is called photosynthesis. Producers include algae, lichens, and mosses, in addition to plants like trees and grasses. Lichens are plant-like organisms that are formed when fungi and algae live together and grow on hard surfaces. They are a favorite food of the caribou. Plants are the first feeding step, or trophic level, of every food chain. All animals depend on plants to live, even if they do not eat plants themselves. Producers at the bottom of every food chain perform another very important job in an ecosystem. As they take in water, sunlight, and carbon dioxide, they also release oxygen into the air. Oxygen is a gas that is essential for all organisms to live. There are producers in every ecosystem. Without them, there would be no life on Earth. The next trophic level is composed of consumers. Animals cannot make their own food. Even though animals and humans receive some energy directly from the sun, they also must consume or eat food to get the energy and nutrients they need to survive. Who can share what nutrients are? That's right, substances that provide nourishment for survival. Sometimes this trophic level is broken into more than one level, or feeding step, because there are several different types of consumers, or eaters. The consumers in this image are the mouse, the boar, and the wolf. Some consumers eat only plants, some eat only animals, and others eat both plants and animals. These three types of consumers have specific names. Who remembers what we call animal consumers who consume only plants? Yes, plant eaters are called herbivores. Herbivores may be as small as squirrels or as large as elephants. Can you name some other herbivores, consumers who eat only producers? The second type of consumers belongs to the group called carnivores. Who knows what carnivores eat? That's right, carnivores are primarily meat eaters. Carnivores usually do not eat producers, but instead eat other consumers. Examples of carnivorous animals include lions, polar bears, and sharks. Omnivores are the third type of consumers. They eat both producers and other consumers. Rats, raccoons, skunks, and pigs are all omnivores. Many humans are omnivores too, eating both plants and animals. Do you eat both plants and animals? Then you are an omnivore. Raise your hand if you are an omnivore. When plants and animals die, they sometimes become food for other animals. Have you ever seen a vulture or a crow eating dead animals by the roadside? These consumers are animals called scavengers. A scavenger will eat animals that have already died or will consume items from the garbage. Some scavengers, such as crows, also eat living plants and animals, but scavengers rarely finish the job. For that, nature relies upon another essential part of the food chain. Who remembers the name of the organisms that work together with the producers and the consumers? They are the decomposers: earthworm, ground beetle, and microorganisms. Scavengers are always animals, whereas decomposers can be animals, fungi, or microorganisms such as bacteria. Decomposers are a special type of consumer that continues the work of scavengers if parts are left behind. Decomposers decompose or break down dead plants and animals and their wastes. By doing so, they feed themselves while returning valuable nutrients back into the soil to be reused by other organisms in the food chain. Just as with scavengers, some decomposers also eat living plants and animals. Decomposers, worms, slugs, snails, beetles, and other insects, microscopic bacteria, and fungi are some of Earth's greatest recyclers. They are very important to an ecosystem. Without decomposers, plants would not get the nutrients they need, and Earth would be crowded with the dead remains of plants and animals. Producers, consumers, and decomposers, the three essential parts to every food chain, create a cycle of energy. Energy is transferred in a circular fashion from one organism to another and back again into the soil to help new producers grow. What word part do you recognize in circular? What do you think circular means? If there were no producers, there would be nothing for consumers to consume, so there would be no consumers. Without consumers, there would be nothing to decompose, so there would be no need for decomposers. Producers, consumers, and decomposers are equally dependent upon one another. They are interdependent links in all food chains, passing stored energy from one organism to another. The ongoing, regular completion of this energy cycle in food chains determines an ecosystem's ability to survive. Let's look at an example of another rather simple food chain. First, a leaf creates its own food. Next, a caterpillar eats the leaf. Then, a small bird eats the caterpillar. Then, a large bird of prey swoops down and eats the small bird. Energy has passed from the leaf to the caterpillar, to the small bird, to the bird of prey. How many trophic levels are represented? Who was the producer? The leaf. Who were the consumers? There were three. Can you name them? First, the caterpillar consumed the leaf. Next, a small bird consumed the caterpillar. Then, the large bird consumed the small bird. But that is not the end of the cycle, is it? What is the final step? That's right. Finally, the large bird dies, and the decomposers begin their important work of breaking down the animal's body into the soil and helping new producers to grow. This simple food chain can be drawn with arrows onto a piece of paper. See, this is the food chain I have drawn. But nature is rarely that simple. Think about what else could happen to change the simple pattern of these circular arrows. Who else might eat the caterpillar? Perhaps a lizard or a frog would find the caterpillar tasty. And who else might eat the small bird? Perhaps a cat or snake would make a meal of it. Lizards and frogs and cats and snakes are members of other food chains as well. When an animal from one food chain eats a member of another food chain, two food chains connect. And the chains begin to look far more complicated with many arrows going many different ways. When food chains overlap like this, the complicated patterns that they form are called food webs. Many different plants and animals can be included in food webs. Before we get together again, go for a walk around your neighborhood to see how many connections you can find in nature around you. What different parts of food chains can you identify? Who eats the berries, flowers, seeds, and nuts that plants produce? Who eats the bark of trees and the blades of grass? We'll talk more about food chains and food webs next time. See you soon! All right, class. Now that we've finished our read aloud about producers, it's time to put on our thinking caps and dive into some comprehension questions. Take a moment to think about your predictions regarding how you might be connected to an ant or a bee. Were your predictions correct? Why or why not? Discuss with your partner. Now, who would like to share their thoughts with the class? Remember to restate the question in your response and provide a complete answer.
My prediction was correct because I realized that I depend on plants for food, and ants and bees also depend on plants. So indirectly, we're all connected through the food chain.
Excellent explanation. So we can see that our connection to ants and bees is through the food chain, where we all depend on plants for survival. Now, let's move on to the next question. Today, you learned that organisms in an ecosystem are interdependent. What does it mean for things to be interdependent? Take a moment to think about it, then discuss with your partner. Who would like to share their understanding of interdependence with the class?
Interdependence means that things depend on each other for their survival. In an ecosystem, different organisms rely on each other for food, shelter, and other needs.
Well said. In an ecosystem, organisms are indeed interdependent, relying on each other for various resources. What things might a mouse be dependent on in its ecosystem? Good job. Grains, nuts, etc. What animal might be dependent on mice for food? You are right. Owls, wild cats, etc. Now let's move on to the next question. Take a look at this illustration. How would you describe it? Excellent observation. It's an ecosystem in which a food chain has formed among the leaf, the caterpillar, the small bird, the large bird, and the decomposers. Now, what is a food chain? You're right. It's a relationship of living things as food sources for other living things. Now, let's move on to the next question. What are trophic levels? Well done. They are connecting steps in a food chain. What is the smallest number of trophic levels in a food chain? Good job. 2. What is an example of a food chain with at least 3 living things? Yes, an example of a food chain with at least 3 living things. Grass, grasshopper, frog, snake. Next question. What are 3 essential parts of a food chain? What does each of these parts do? Good job. The 3 essential parts of a food chain are producers, consumers, and decomposers. Producers make their own food and nutrients through photosynthesis. Consumers eat other plants and animals for food and nutrients. Decomposers break down dead plants and animals. Why do we say producers, consumers, and decomposers operate in a circular fashion? You are right. First, energy is transferred from a producer to a consumer, then to another consumer, and finally back again to the soil, where the decomposers break it down and help new producers grow. Next, what is a food web? Good job. It's a complex, interconnected network of food chains. Next question is, how are food chains, food webs, human body systems, and road systems similar? What 2 words can be used to describe them? Excellent. They are all interconnected networks. We can use interconnected and complex to describe them. Let's move to the next question. Algae is one example of a producer. What are 2 more examples? You are right. Moss, trees, plants, lichen, grasses, etc. Now, what is an example of a consumer and a decomposer? Good job. A mouse, boar, and wolf for consumer and worms, slugs, snails, beetles, other insects, fungi, and microscopic bacteria for decomposers. Now let's move on to the next question. What are the 3 types of consumers? Good job. They are herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores. Now, compare and contrast these types of consumers with your partner. Great comparison. They all are living organisms, animals, and need food to live, etc. Herbivores mainly eat producers like plants, while carnivores and omnivores eat other consumers. But omnivores are unique because they eat both plants and animals. Now, let's continue with our Think, Pair, Share activity. Reflect on whether you consider yourself a producer, consumer, or decomposer. How do you know? Very insightful. We are consumers. Humans cannot make our own food through photosynthesis as plants do. We eat plants and animals for food. Well done, everyone. You all did a fantastic job discussing and reflecting on these important concepts. Keep up the great work. Now we're going to explore a fascinating topic called producers. Can everyone say the word producers with me?
Producers.
Great job. Now, who can remind us what producers are? Good job. Producers are living things that make their own energy and provide their own nutrients. And how do producers make their own food? You are right. They use light and water to make food in their leaves through photosynthesis. Now let's think about some examples of producers. Can anyone give me an example of a producer? Remember to use the word producers when you tell us about it.
A producer I saw once was a tree. Trees make their own food through photosynthesis.
Excellent. Trees are indeed producers because they make their own energy. Who else wants to share?
I remember seeing grass in the park. Grass is a producer because it makes its own food too.
That's right. Grass is another great example of a producer. You all are doing fantastic. Now, let's review. What's the word we've been talking about today?
Producers.
And what part of speech is the word producers? You are right, it's a noun. Excellent! You all did an amazing job learning about producers today. Keep up the great work. Now, we're going to do something really fun and hands-on. We're going to sort some image cards into groups based on whether they represent producers, consumers, or decomposers. Let's get started. Take a look at these cards and think about whether each one represents a producer, consumer, or decomposer. All right, class. Let's take a look at this picture. Can anyone tell me what animal we see here? Take a moment to look closely and think about it. Once you have an idea, raise your hand. Excellent observation. Yes, they are ant, caterpillar, grasshopper, and millipede. The next one. Yes, it's a squirrel! How about this one? Good job. It's kangaroo rat. Yes, this is a thrush! Whales. Beavers. Bear. Spider monkey. Beetle. Camel. Zebras and wildebeests. Antelope. Arctic fox. Caribou. Freshwater fish, piranha and other fish. Saltwater fish. Lion. Hawk. Polar bears. Shark. Jaguar. Vulture. Algae, grass and berries, lichen and moss. Fungi, earthworm, ground beetle, and microorganisms. Now, we're going to dive into the fascinating world of ecosystems and the roles different organisms play within them. We'll be sorting some image cards into groups based on their ecological roles as producers, consumers, and decomposers. As you can see, we have quite a variety of organisms here. Now, who can remind us what producers, consumers, and decomposers are? Excellent! Producers are organisms that make their own food, usually through photosynthesis. Consumers are organisms that obtain energy by consuming other organisms, and decomposers break down dead organic matter into simpler substances. Now, let's start sorting these cards. Let's start with the ant, caterpillar, grasshopper, and millipede. Where do you think these organisms belong? Producers, consumers, or decomposers? Yes, they are consumers. Let's place them in the consumer group. Now, let's take a look at the squirrel and kangaroo rat. What do you think their role in the ecosystem is? Exactly. Squirrels and kangaroo rats are consumers as well. So let's add them to the consumer group. Next is trush. It is for consumers as well, so let's add it to the consumer group. Next is whale. It is consumers too, so let's add it to the consumer group. Now that it's bear, it's consumers too, so let's add it to the consumer group. The next one is hawk. It is for consumers too, so let's add it to the consumer group. The next one is beetle. It is for consumers too, so let's add it to the consumer group. The next one is beaver. It is for consumers too, so let's add it to the consumer group. The next one is polar bear. It is for consumers too, so let's add it to the consumer group. Next is spider monkey. It is for consumers too, so let's add it to the consumer group. Next is saltwater fish. It is for consumers too, so let's add it to the consumer group. Next is zebras and wildebeests. They are for consumers too, so let's add them to the consumer group. Next is jaguar. It is for consumers too, so let's add it to the consumers group. Next is freshwater fish. It is for consumers too, so let's add it to the consumer group. Next is antelope. It is for consumers too, so let's add it to the consumers group. Next are fungi, earthworm, ground beetle, and microorganisms. They are for the decomposers group. Let's add them to the decomposers group. Next is vulture. It is for consumers too, so let's add it to the consumer group. Next is Arctic fox. It is for consumers too, so let's add it to the consumer group. Next is camel. It is for consumers too, so let's add it to the consumer group. Next is lion. It is for consumers too, so let's add it to the consumer group. Next is caribou. It is for consumers too, so let's add it to the consumer group. Next are algae, grass and berries, lichen and moss. They are for the producers group. Let's add them to the producers group. Next is shark. It is for consumers too, so let's add it to the consumer group. Fantastic job, everyone! We've successfully sorted all the image cards into groups of producers, consumers, and decomposers. Remember, every organism plays a vital role in maintaining the balance of an ecosystem. Keep up the great work in exploring the wonders of nature.